Hello everyone, and welcome to Steam Engine 13, coming to you from the Neville Public Museum. Steam Engine is an event series highlighting interesting topics delivered through the lens of our STEAM disciplines: science, technology, engineering, the arts, and mathematics. What I'm saying is Steam Engine is just a cool platform to showcase cool people doing cool stuff. Steam Engine is a platform for locals to just discuss their ideas. So if you have an idea that you want to see elevated and discussed, please share it with us. Head to our webpage at steamenginegb.com to share your idea with us. So all of this is made possible because of our incredible sponsors. Big thank you to all of you, starting with our title sponsor, US Venture. Fox Communities Credit Union, Northeast Wisconsin Technical College, St. Norbert College, Schneider School of Business, and University of Wisconsin Green Bay. Big thank you to all of you. 2021 is well on its way, coming for us. We're already developing great content, and we're looking for a new title sponsor. So if you, your business, your organization, your group of best friends is looking for a new project to support, consider supporting Steam Engine Green Bay. On to Steam Engine 13. The event theme is social justice. Tonight we're talking about fairness in terms of access to opportunities. These can be opportunities to wealth, education, home ownership, or just basic survival. Over the past year, the greater Green Bay area has reached a critical mass of voices discussing social justice topics. Now, although conversations about justice are hundreds of years old in our country, it is more recent that our community at large has begun to unpack the terms and the impacts of social, political, and economic mechanisms that perpetuate disparities. These disparities include gaps in education achievement, access to homeownership, equal pay, and disproportionate health outcomes. Social justice is impacted by multiple factors on multiple fronts, and the fight for it will leave lasting images for generations to come. I know all of that was a mouthful and a brainful, and that's why we have three fascinating presenters, all experts in their fields, to help us think through social justice. We've had the honor of sitting down with Angel Saavedra Cisneros, Jonathan Dunbar, and Shea Correra to discuss social justice through the work that they do. You're probably viewing from the sanctity of your own space, so feel free to laugh, cry, shout, or just sit totally stone-faced while you digest these conversations with our presenters. Hopefully you've got some questions too, and since we're in a new format and we're streaming this video on Facebook, you have the opportunity to comment and ask questions throughout the presentation. The guests will join us live after the video to answer your questions and respond to your comments. When you add a comment or ask a question, you will automatically be entered in a drawing for a free Steam Engine t-shirt, just like that, designed and printed by local Bay Area artists. So without further ado, Steam Engine 13.
Hi all, it's my pleasure. I'm Lucy Arndt, and it's my pleasure to be interviewing Dr. Angel Saavedra Cisneros. He's got a great elevator pitch, and so I want to make sure I share it with all of you. He says, it's human nature, it's divisive, it's tribalism, it's avoidable, it's a way for the other side to win. Identities are all around us, but they are less a source of division than some would make them seem. A bit more of a bio on Dr. Saavedra. He's an assistant professor of political science at St. Norbert College, which is where I am as well. His interests are in political psychology and racial and ethnic politics. His book, Latino Identity and Political Attitudes, Why Are Latinos Not Republican?, won the 2017 Best Book in Race and Political Behavior Award from the Racial, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association. He tries to use psychological theories to explain political phenomena and has just launched the SNC, that's short for St. Norbert College, SNC Political Identities Lab, a graduate-style lab where students and faculty meet to discuss current debates in political identities and develop testable hypotheses to create new pathways in our understandings of politics and race. So here we are, Angel. I have a beginning question for you. Your interest in identity politics, where does that come from? I'm super interested in knowing more about this. And what can you tell us about identity politics?
It comes from my interest in human nature. So I want to understand why people do what they do. And so I lived in Wisconsin as a kid. I'm Mexican, and I've been very sheltered my whole life. And then I started refereeing. So I started refereeing in college, and in Utah, when you referee, it's just white kids. Then I moved to Long Island, and then I was refereeing teams that were Guatemalan,
Okay.
and teams that were from Trinidad, and teams that were Polish and Italian, and then all the white teams, and then the Mexican team, and then there were 2 black teams. And that to me made no sense, right? Because I believed that racism was over, that the United States was this country where I'd been sheltered my whole life. So I lived in a college, not town, but college setting. So my friends in elementary school were from all over the world. I don't know, they said like 100 languages were spoken at my elementary school. And so I assumed that was the United States that we live in. And then I started seeing these things. And then I started reading more about it, and reading more about the politics of identity. And that's when I realized that, whoa, there's this thing that's still here, right? There's still racism. I have been the victim of racism, but I never noticed it until actually, like, my son has highlighted things, said, that's kind of racist. And I realized that yeah, there are things that people have told me that are racist, but I never thought they were important.
Sure.
But seeing it in the US and seeing it play out politically was what really got me into this idea of like, what drives people to be one or another.
Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah, so today I'm gonna tell you a couple things.
Okay.
So I like to start out with the elephant in the room, because identity politics is everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's more than elephant. It's air,
Yeah,
right? So,
exactly.
and I want to start with these quotes, and I'll read them directly because we hear these all the time. Politicizing identity, weaponizing identity, creating division. We are all Americans, right? And that makes sense if you ignore history and if you ignore the human condition, right? And so when we think about identities, we want to think about what it means that who we are, right? And I want to use this quote from Paul Lazarsfeld in his book. He basically uses a layman's quote to understand politics, right? And he says, politics, who gets what, when, and how. And the who is the first thing, right? So that's the identity, it's who. Yeah. And in this country, we know that some people have gotten more than others over time.
Sure.
And that's identity politics, right? When one group of people gets something and the other does not. So in addition to that, I want to talk about identity as being a human thing, right? We think about who we are. We find people like us all the time. And it's not just racial identity. There's all kinds of identities. But there are some that matter more politically. And so I think that we've had this weird shift in recent American politics where we've gone from our social identities helping inform our political identities, where now they're mixed, right? So people now have this sense that who they think they are as a human being reflects on who they are in politics, right? So it's a weird situation that we're in right now. And so I like to rely on political psychology to understand, well, how is it that people got here? Like, how does all of a sudden who wins the election matter so much for my emotional well-being, right? Because that's where we're at now. And identities are primal, right? We have these as human beings, and I want to bring in another somewhat famous person, Aristotle, and he quoted that man is a political animal, right? So there's many things to unpack there. I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not going to. But yeah, we are political beings. And if our identities are important for politics, they're important for us as humans. And we are fairly predictable in ways that we might not have thought of before.
Cool, very cool.
So I'm going to hopefully try to tell you of a few things today, right? So I'm going to tell you that, yes, identities are everywhere and that they're primal. And I use the word identities, not identity, on purpose. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We have multiple identities. They're fluid. They can be primed. What does that mean? That sometimes they're there without us knowing. And then they can be politicized, right? So we see this in multiple contexts. And I don't want to go into the US context right now, but we see them all over the world where an identity, a given identity that might make no sense to us as an outside observer, matters heavily and leads to war. And then I want to tell you that identities can be good and bad. And again, why? Because they're fluid, because they can be used for different things. And so there's positives and negatives to identities. And then last, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of social capital, which has been talked about a lot, but I am a latecomer to the concept. And I discovered that identities can help us understand social capital that binds, that makes one group closer together. And then there's social capital that actually bridges. And that's where some of my future research is headed. And so I do want to kind of convince you that that's something we should be looking at.
Awesome.
So I want to start with tribalism, right? And of course, the Lambo leap, right? And when we use the word tribalism, we're referencing this idea that we as humans have existed in society and groups for hundreds of thousands of years, and at least tens of thousands, right? So we've gotten together, we've created things, and we identify with people who are like us, and like us is defined by whatever, right? And so we think that there are identities that are natural, that are permanent, and that is the way of thinking of identities as just something that is almost animalistic. But then we know that identities are not always set in stone, right? So Tajfel and Turner are these were famous researchers, and they came up with the social psychologists, and they came up with two important, we can talk about paradigms, but theories, right? Social identity theory, and then I forgot this one. Yeah, I always forget the other one, which is
some other really important.
Right. Yeah. Self-categorization theory. Right. So and they go hand in hand, right? So social identity theory is their big contribution, and it's just this idea that you derive value from the groups you belong to. And then social categorization theory is that you will position yourself with a group that gives you more worth. Right?
Can you give an example of?
Yeah.
So folks know exactly
so
what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, and it really depends if you want to go like political or not. But one clear example is, when someone's team is winning, you like wear your shirt proudly. When they're not, you might not.
Well,
right?
unless you're a Packer fan. No matter what.
I've been to the games. I've heard the cheering subside.
But it's still
at
there.
Third quarter, right? Yeah. No, but that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
Like all of a sudden you being loud and rambunctious, saying, "Yeah, this is my team."
For sure.
If your team is like losing, I've seen it here more than in other places, and it was surprising to me because I believe that that's your identity when you're winning, right? And the same is true in politics, right? When you are a member of the governing group or when you're a member of the most powerful group, you like that, right? And an example of this is the caste system in India, right? Where it's strong identities. These systems, these identities, these levels, they're pretty artificial, but they were created to try to keep some people in more power than others. And so you can be grateful if you move from one lower caste to the next because you've made it, right? And so that's how this works, right? And you want to categorize yourself as saying, I'm not like them. Right? This happens to us all the time. Yes, I am this, but I'm not like them.
I'm not that.
Right? And so one of the things that they did in their studies, which is crazy, that shows us that we can actually prime these identities, was they told people, do you like Bach or Stravinsky, right? Or like, or you are an overestimator or underestimator, like meaningless categories, like not even colors, right? Just like, okay, you prefer this to that. And then they created different like competitions. And what they found, luckily this has been changed a little bit, but what they found originally was that people were willing to take a reduction in their payment if they got to hurt the other team more, right? So they were willing to actually give up money as long as the other team, the Stravinsky team, right, or the overestimator team would get less, right? And so by now we've actually seen that outgroup derogation doesn't always happen with in-group love, but this is one of the things that they discovered, that we can create these artificial groups, and all of a sudden, wow, okay, we have something, right? And here's where this idea that race is a social construct is important, because race doesn't matter unless it matters, right? And that's what we've done politically, right? So race and politics feed into each other, and so in our country, it is these basic racial distinctions, and it used to be black and white. And those were the distinctions that made sense in this country. And then we had different groups come from different places, and they say, okay, well, we've ignored American Indians. We've ignored the people who were here before everyone else. Yeah, let's exclude them too, right? And so there were these categories, and if you look at the census, you can see that the census tries to keep up with the politics, right? So the census is a political tool, and the new categories that emerge are based on these political distinctions. So, you know, what is black? It depended, right? Like 100 years ago, if you kind of looked black, you were probably black, right? If you had an ancestor who was black, you're probably black. But now we're thinking of identities as much less restrictive and more fluid, right? So you can be, you know, my dad is black or not, right?
Yeah.
And this is, you know, I can talk about, if you want, like about my own identity, which is really weird because I'm just Mexican. Like but when I go places, people are like, what are you? You know, they have no idea who I am, what I am. And then I speak and they're like, oh, you're an American. I'm like, nah, I'm like, I'll show you my passport. I've got a Mexican passport. Right? And so that's my identity when I'm in Europe, in France, because, you know, I'm not, right?
Yeah.
I'd rather be the Mexican. But when I'm here, that's a different thing, right? So identities are constructed and they're used differently, but again, they have an impact. They shape the way, not only the way we see the world, but the way we act upon the world and the way the world acts on us.
I think that's really interesting because I think the average person, if you just ask them, you know, irrespective of this whole conversation, they'd say, oh no, my identity is sort of fixed, right? They wouldn't be thinking, well, actually, depending on my situation or with whom I might be interacting, maybe I would change the way I would describe myself. Very interesting.
Yeah, and it's context dependent, right? Everything, like, because if you go to Uganda, right? Like, you're a white person, right? I was called a haole in Hawaii. Like, I'm not a haole, right? But I was called a haole. And I'm just like, this is bad for me because it really hurt my sense of self and pride.
I get it.
Right? Because I was now the outsider.
Yeah, you think you're this, but other people are seeing you from their context. Super interesting.
So, and I want, you know, this belonging part is, I share these pictures, right? So over here on the left-hand side, you have pictures of the EPL this season. So every game at the English Premier League, they kneel. And every single one is kneeling, right? So you have 2 black players, white player, and a referee. And the referee joining them is a big deal for referees because most referees say they're going to stay out of everything.
Right.
But in this case, it's belonging to this movement, right? This Black Lives Matter movement. In the middle is somebody violating these group norms. So that's Lambeau Field, and that's an Eagles player jumping in there. Not supposed to, right? So people got angry, right? But but the other guy did it. You know, he's wearing the wrong uniform. You know, if he were to be traded the next season, he'd be welcome. Right. And then on the right-hand side, we have a picture of Colin Kaepernick when he was a kid, right, wearing his Packers jersey, right? Why? Because this was his identity. Is his identity. He's a football player, right? And so I share this picture in the middle because it's the same picture as before, just a different uniform. And now people hate him, right?
Yeah, fascinating.
So it's the same thing.
You know, there have to be positives and negatives to identity politics, right? I mean, as you continue to talk about this, just something else. You know, what are your thoughts on the positives and the negatives?
So they can unite, right? They can help people come together. They can help people think of each other as being connected, interconnected, right? I mean, it's all about unity, right?
Right.
And so because we know that identities are not stuck, they're so up for grabs, let's call them that way, they can actually help people heal. So the picture here, you know, George Bush, everyone felt American.
Yes.
Right? Even non-Americans felt American. Right? I was getting calls, I was in college, and I was getting calls from my friends from back home, are you okay? I'm like, yeah, I'm in Utah, that was New York City. Yeah. Like, well, that's got to be so terrifying. So the world came together with this horrible attack, right? They can reduce the distance between people, right? So if you just tell people, hey, we're all Packers fans, right? It doesn't matter that you live over here on this side of the river versus up on the hill on the other side, right? Like, so it can help with creating some sense of unity. Policy-wise, there's a really, really neat study by Transu in political science where he asked people to decide whether or not they're going to give funds to a school that is predominantly African American. So he asked white respondents, and you know, basically they say no because it's a zero-sum game. So the more money you give to the black school, you're going to take away from your local school. But when he makes people think of them as Americans, they say, okay, think of yourself as American. Think of yourself as being part of this big country and whatever the US represents. And then he asks, the same question, different group of people. He finds that they're actually willing to give more money to African Americans at their own expense, right? So you have this, it's flipping the script, because they say, well, if we're all the same country and some of us are being underserved, well, that's wrong, right? And so it unites there. And then the negative, we can use it to divide. We've seen that, like we have lots of divisions in this country. It can be used for nationalism. And here there's this interesting, I'm just showing this, as Newsday is a newspaper in Long Island. They did a study where they found that there were hundreds of people being discriminated against and not shown the same places as others to go find a home. So there was huge discrimination by realtors. Here you can't really see, but this is Green Bay. This is from the UVA, the University of Virginia, has this map that shows segregated cities. And yes, Green Bay is segregated, but the one thing that catches my attention, that caught my son's attention too, there's a green square on here, right? And that tells us how our society treats. And if you look at green on the code is black. And that green square is a prison, right? And so, yes, we have these barriers, and some barriers are literal and physical. And so that's how we think of a lot of these people, right?
Sure.
And I can talk about my own, I caught myself being racist several times I have. So I can talk about those if you want, but I want to kind of continue on this positive and negative, which the nationalist issue, right, leads to these separations, right? And if you think of the amount of commerce that happens on the US-Mexico border, it's insane, right? Crazy amounts of commerce every day, every single day. And yet we have this huge wall. Right. And on the right-hand side, I have this picture that hurts, angers me. This was during the refugee crisis, and this was a Hungarian reporter, as there were a group of Syrians running. There's a man with his child, and he gets tripped by this reporter, and then the reporter kicks another child running across a border breach, right? So they're trying to get to something they don't know. They're going into Hungary, going to the European Union to try to escape these horrors. But this lady feels that it's important that she trips and kicks, these people because they're not like her, right? They're not Hungarian, and we've seen this rise, right? The rise with Erdogan. We've seen Erdogan's his name, right? So we've seen a huge rise in nationalistic policies all over the world, and this can lead to really horrible things that we saw 70 years ago that hopefully we never see again.
Agreed.
So no identity is inherently political, right? So they have to be politicized. And this is one of the big questions that Americans have always felt, that black and white are important distinctions in society, and they're not necessarily distinctions, right? So in the 1930s, Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish researcher, economist, was brought into the US to study the Negro problem, right? And one of the things that he concluded was that the Negro problem is not a Negro problem, it's a white person problem. And so he reminds us that identity can be politicized. And I wanted to show just this one image, and then I'll skip through the rest of this, because this is an article from 1964, if I'm not mistaken, 1964, February 9th. And here, the New York Times is saying, the New York Times is a history of racism, and being very anti-black. And then in 64, they're repeating what 20 years before Myrdal had said. And now it keeps coming back, right? Even after we keep thinking, well, why are they making it my problem? Because it is your problem. Right. So I'm gonna move on.
It's all good.
Yeah, identity is not just one group, right? It's African Americans, it's white people, it's Latinos, it's Asians. And recently we have some books that say that identity is that having a mixed race identity has important political implications. So there was this idea, as political psychologists, I like to think that we are the party poopers of the world. And so psychiatry and psychology or neuroscience was discovering that oxytocin could help people come together, could help bind people. It's a cuddle hormone.
Right.
And so it was a way to make people get along with each other. We actually found out that it is good for your in-group. You like your in-group more, but you actually dislike the people who are not part of your group more.
Wow.
So we kind of suspended that research. You're like, we're not going to do.
Not going where we wanted to
go.
go.
No, we're not going to just have a plane drop oxytocin on the rest of the world, because we realized that would make things worse. Sure. So that led to binding social capital versus the bridging one. Here's another neat experiment. the people you help on the street, this is Liverpool versus Man U, so that's kind of a big deal. But if you find someone on the street who's injured and they're wearing the wrong jersey, in their study in the UK 15 years ago, they actually found that you're much less likely to help someone wearing the wrong jersey. Unless you make them think of football players, footballers, and people who support football, and then you're more likely to help them than if it was just a random stranger.
Okay.
So,
how do we move forward? I mean, to me, this is the big question, right? Because all this stuff is out there in the ether. We know on the run up to this election, it's kind of been making people crazy, right?
yes.
So how do we do this? How do we move forward in a way that's good not only for some individuals, but really for our entire community?
Well, it's tricky, right? Because identities are used by whoever wants to make some money off of them, if I say it that way, right?
Sure.
But they're used for whatever reason. But we see people who are starting to think that community is more important than whatever label other people are pushing on them. So this picture is in Iowa. The raids 15 years ago were hugely devastated a community. And now people are remembering them and saying, never again. This is not going to happen to our community, right? And so when you see these huge, you see people coming out and protesting. The first big protest, well, we had the Women's March on Washington after Trump was inaugurated, or during inauguration. And then we had huge amounts of people going to the airports when Trump announced his Muslim ban. And that, the people who weren't Muslim, people who maybe don't have any Muslim friends, were saying, this is not who we are. Right? So we're uniting for humanity, for each other, right? And 60 years ago, Gordon Allport wrote his context hypothesis, and The Nature of Prejudice is the title of his book. And we found that knowing people that are not like you helps. It's not enough, right? And there can't be a power disparity, right? So you actually have to work towards a common goal to be able to get rid of these dynamics that have been embedded, right? When we talk about systemic racism, it's because it's embedded, because it's in a system, right? It's structural. We don't see it, but it's there. Sometimes when we talk too much about like, hey, we're all American and stuff, it might lead to nationalism, right? And you see this among Latinos too. So Latinos sometimes say, yeah, no, I'm American. I'm not like them. I'm not an immigrant, right? No, they shouldn't get a free pass. And so it kind of backfires sometimes, but it really depends on how you define your identity, right? So we could heal our country if we become a little more nationalistic, but that's super dangerous. Why? Because then it becomes a US against everyone else.
Yeah.
Because you're not me, you're something else, right? And that's when people are like, oh, you have an accent. I'm picking up on your accent. You have a weird accent, right? Where are you from? And these questions of where you're from, I think can help us understand if we think of them as the context hypothesis. Right? Where are you from? Not like, where are you from? Right? So I think it's important. How do we unite and heal? Well, we can help people think that they have multiple identities at any given time, right? It's not just race. Right now, it's, the Trump identity is huge. There are people who are Trumpian, right? People who are anti-Trump, right? So it's a huge identity, but it's a tiny one, right? And if we remind people, what other identities do you have? Do you like to golf, right? That's an anti-identity for me. But for some people, it's a pro-identity, right? Yes. So do you like to go out and, do you like nature? That's an idea. Do you like to go to watch American football, right? The one played with the hands.
What kind of music do you like? What kind of, all
right,
of it, right?
Yeah. So you find these identities that are actually, you can see that the more identities you're aware of, the more you have in common with more people, right? And so that's where my research is hoping to go towards, helping me understand how we can shape the way you think of yourself and not just say, well, I'm this or that. And even if it's an identity that's like, no, that's it. Like, okay, do you have another identity that overlaps with that? And then you find more and more. And then you can find that you have multiple overlaps. And the problem with that is really hard to measure. So as a political scientist, as a person who wants to publish these things, it's really hard to measure because we know it when we feel it. We're like, oh, I just connected. But then what am I going to do? Am I going to ask on a survey, how much did you connect with that person you just spoke to?
Right. Did you feel it?
So I think we can heal, right? I think there's a lot of work in political and social psychology that helps us understand it, but it's really hard to convince people if they can't actually feel it.
Yeah, I mean, I think about my stuff with disasters. In the aftermath of a disaster, communities come together. People who neighbors who didn't even talk to each other previously, all of a sudden they all have this united front, right? And so there's this thing together that they're battling, that they're dealing with. And that can last for a long time, and then they sort of typically drift back into the usual. But for some time, and so this is where the source of hope is, right? For some time, they're able to unite and come together and see everyone as us, as opposed to us and them. Yeah.
And this is what happened in Nebraska, right? So there are some times that communities will surround ICE vehicles to say, you're not taking away this person, right? They are a member of our community, you are not taking them away. And we've seen multiple of these, and these people are risking their lives to get run over. And they say, no, this is who we are, and we're standing up, right? And it's Nebraska, right? It's not liberal California, no. It is people who know their community and want to grow it. And that's how we heal, that's how we move forward. So we use identities to become better.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure.
And that's a wrap, as they say. Thank you. Good job.